Hi, my name is Marta Struminska-Kutra and I'm affiliated with Specialized University in Oslo as well as Koźmiński University in Warsaw, Poland. And I'm going to have a presentation that is titled Towards Power Sensitive Concept of Postnormal Science. Although I must say I see this presentation maybe more as an introduction to the session that is going to be devoted to the questions of power, more as a presentation of my own paper or my own writings about the subject. But let me start illustrating the way I'm thinking about power and postnormal science concept. Um, Generally speaking, postnormal science theorizes the relationship between science and society by focusing on uncertainty and lack of consensus or values. It suggests that when facts are uncertain and values in dispute, the decision-making process should undergo a transformation from one-way communication and a discourse of demonstration to or towards two-way communication and a discourse of dialogue. And my presentation, and in fact the whole session, is focused on a challenge that accompanies this transformation. This challenge is a challenge of power asymmetries that inevitably infiltrate dialogue spaces. So let me start with referring to some well-known formulations of this problem. First, I would like to present you a famous quote from Andrew Lang, a Scottish poet, a novelist, and literary critic. And it says, "Most people use scientific evidence like a drunk man uses a lamppost, more for support than illumination." When saying most people, he for sure meant politicians as well. I would like to extend this illustration by referring to a very old but excellent, in my opinion, example provided by Henrik Ibsen in his drama titled An Enemy of the People. And here I shall thank to Jerry Ravitz, who introduced me to this particular piece of Ibsen's work. An Enemy of the People tells a story of a man, Dr. Stockman, who dares to speak an unpalatable truth to the power and to the people, and is punished for it. Long story short, he discovers a poisonous bacteria in the water of the city, which has just recently invested large amounts of money in building baths infrastructure. He sees himself as an independent scientist speaking truth to the power. He thinks he saves people's life and health, and he thinks they should admire him for that. In fact, he longs for recognition and displays scientific hubris. He does not intend to be political, but his actions have political consequences and are perceived as political by the local community. Before he even realizes, he becomes a pawn in the political game. Eventually, he is put under pressure to withdraw his evidence-based conclusions, but he refuses. By doing that, he does not only sacrifices his own social position, but also position of his family. I would say that Dr. Stockman's failure was that he was naive about speaking scientific truth to the power and to the people. I would say it was a failure of pre-advanced level, and that is a failure of ignoring diversity of stakes around his evidence. And I think postnormal science is not naive about that at all. This is why it proposes expanded peer communities and inclusion of different types of knowledges. Still, I think postnormal science is exposed to making a failure on this more advanced level. The failure is an assumption that first, all parties are interested in dialogue and exchange of arguments, and second, that dialogue takes place among equals. Well, maybe the latter is a bit unfair. Postnormal science does not make an assumption about equality. Rather, I would say it does not pay enough attention to the fact that parties of dialogue are not equal. So, PNS proposes dialogue and inclusion as an answer to uncertainty and dispute over values. What kind of challenges are involved when practicing science in line with postnormal guidelines? How do we practice, for example, new discourse of dialogue instead of old discourse of demonstration? How do we practice new methodology, including extended peer community of participants who bring their own commitments, interests, and values to the table? The implementation of postnormal science idea would be much easier if decision-making would have taken place in an open, coercion-free, communicative space where all voices are heard and taken into consideration. In such a space, scientists could then facilitate democratic dialogue by either aligning with an interest group, a role that Roger Pilke calls issue advocate, or by delivering scientific knowledge and therefore expanding scope of choices for collective decision-making, the role called by Roger Pilke honest broker of policy alternatives. But most of decision-making situations involving uncertainty and conflict over values are not and are nothing like coercion-free communicative spaces. So my claim is that postnormal science needs to develop political literacy, ability to deal with power relationships. It means taking to grips with the fact that knowledge is often used as an ammunition in power struggles. And ignoring this tendency means allowing the more powerful party to prevail, and it exposes postnormal science to the risk of corruption. This is what the honest broker of policy alternatives does. He ignores power differences. On the other hand, attempts to make the chances equal mean taking a political stance. So this is the tension we face and need to find ways to navigate through it. I see investigation of postnormal science practice as a major way forward. In particular, I see participatory approaches as a laboratory for development of politically aware postnormal science. Participatory approaches to research represent shift from critical thinking to critical performativity, active and subversive interventions into discourses and practices. These interventions reveal that postnormal scientists involved in collaborative initiatives and postnormal science itself need tools to handle political and power-laden context in which knowledge is co-produced and utilized. And during this session, I would like us to take a little bit of a strategic approach, and I would like us to engage with the question, what institutional infrastructure is needed to carry the idea of dialogue and dialogue in and over science, and an idea of extended peer community. I think that this question can be operationalized on very many different levels. So I would like us to perform a sort of a gap analysis, which would show us what do we need to have in place in order to be able to meaningfully practice postnormal science. For example, we would need new institutions regulating dialogue at the interface of science and society. So there are, of course, many authors already who engage with this kind of issues. We have some institutions in place that enable that, for example, citizens panels, but they still have an experimental status. They are not institutionalized yet. So what are the tools? What are the institutions that would carry this post-normal science concept and would enable practicing it in political spaces? What kind of institutions would we need in research design if we are going for interactive research, including stakeholders? What kind of methodological tools do we need, and do we need to design and develop? What kind of new teaching contents do we need? For example, do we need use case studies in policy dilemmas as part of philosophy of science teaching? This is also done already, but still is not a very popular exercise. What kind of new roles and skills do we need as researchers and academics to actually perform post-normal science? Do our research teams need to be supplemented by mediators and professional facilitators that would perform a role of inclusiveness advocates? What else? I'm quite sure there is a huge potential there, and there is also a huge need in us engaging in this kind of discussions and questions. So I'm looking forward to our discussions during this fifth post-normal symposium. Thank you.